The 8.2 notes focus on submergent coastal ecosystems. These would be the ecosystems that exist along coastlines that are completely underwater. The first example that we're going to talk about would be seagrasses, which are flowering plants that grow in saltwater environments, and actually they engineer their own habitat. Now, they are only found in tropical regions, and if we focus on the diagram at the bottom of the slide, if we look here locally, here is the Jacksonville area, and we'll notice that there's really no seagrass beds to speak of in our area. There may be patches, but really the density is very low. Now, South Florida, we can see there they experience a lot of seagrass beds down that way. That's because it's more tropical down in South Florida. Globally speaking, the greatest density of seagrass beds exists over in the Indonesia area. Lots of seagrasses over there north of Australia and southeast of Asia. Now, the seagrass beds are similar to other halophyte or saltwater plant-based ecosystems that we've talked about. We've talked about mangrove forests and salt marshes, and seagrasses are similar in that they provide shelter and stabilize sediments. And if we look in this picture here, you can see that the seagrass definitely is holding sediment in place, and also they provide little niches here for organisms to grow and hide, so you'll find a lot of juvenile organisms in seagrasses. Now, seagrasses differ from these other halophyte ecosystems in three important ways. One is that seagrasses are submergent, which means that they can grow in deeper water, and you can see that on this picture at the bottom here. So they never emerge out of the surface of the water. Secondly, they do not need a freshwater source, so they don't need rain, which allows them to be completely under the salt water. And seagrasses are also edible, so they provide food for ecosystem inhabitants. One of the seagrass is actually called turtle grass because it's the main diet of a lot of sea turtles in the area. So that again shows seagrasses are edible. Now, mangrove trees and spartina, which is cordgrass that's found in salt marshes, that is not edible. So again, seagrasses differ from those communities in this way. Now, the second submergent coastal ecosystem we're going to talk about here would be the kelp forests. These are underwater areas with a high density of kelp. Now, kelp is a brown algae, and you may recall from an earlier video that it can grow, especially the giant kelp, can grow very fast, up to 1 meter a day. So they're very productive and dynamic. And they are found globally in cool water because they need a lot of nutrients. So they're going to be found in areas that are not tropical. In fact, for the United States, we have a lot of kelp beds out on the west coast because the west coastal water is much colder. There's a lot of upwelling, and so there's plenty of nutrients for this kelp to grow. Kelp forests suffer when we have an El Nino event. You may recall when we talked about currents, and El Nino is when there's a buildup of warm water in the South Pacific Ocean. And this messes with the currents globally and raises temperatures on the western coast of California. So this causes kelps to die off, and it disrupts the local ecosystems for a couple of years. Now we're going to turn our attention to coral reefs, which are underwater structures made from calcium carbonate or limestone that is secreted by coral polyps. Corals are animals a lot like sea anemones. They are found in shallow tropical waters. So if we look again at the distribution of coral reefs globally, notice here in our area, most of them are concentrated in the South Florida region. We look globally, we come over here to the western Pacific Ocean, north of Australia. We've got a lot of coral reef out there. In fact, some of you may recall the or are familiar with the Great Barrier Reef that exists north of Australia. So a lot of coral density out in that region. And that should make sense because that really is the oldest part of the ocean right there. So that has been there for a long time, and coral has had a longer time to grow on it. Now, most scientists believe that coral reefs are the most taxonomically diverse ecosystems, and this picture that I just put up on the screen should show you why they think that. I mean, you look at the numbers of different fishes that exist in this area, the corals, sponges, and everything. So the biodiversity in tropical reefs is extremely high. Now, let's talk about the coral polyps themselves. Coral polyps, if you look at this picture here, are, again, they're like very small sea anemones, and they exist in colonies. Now, they're unique in that inside they have algae or dinoflagellates living inside of them that require sunlight. So there are some specific conditions that coral reefs need, and the first of which is clear water, so that there can be plenty of light for photosynthesis for those dinoflagellates. Now, those dinoflagellates are called zooxanthellae. So that's a fun new word for you guys to try to pronounce. Now, they also need moderate currents to prevent sediments from accumulating on top of these polyps. These polyps are pretty small, so they can't be covered with any sand or anything. And they need low nutrients because they don't want any other algae to grow on top of them. They want just the algae inside their bodies to get sunlight. Now, unfortunately, coral reefs, even though they are high in biodiversity, are very susceptible to certain threats. And let's talk about those now. The first of which is what we call eutrophication, which is a rise in water nutrient levels. And that's a problem because that allows competitive algae to overgrow colonies. We're seeing increased problems with this because as we fertilize lawns, we see that more nutrients make it out into the ocean. So there's really not supposed to be any nutrients in tropical regions where corals grow, but now they're starting to show up because of man-made fertilizers. Global warming may also cause a problem for corals in causing temperatures to rise above coral survival threshold. And that would be a problem because it would cause coral bleaching. The picture that I put over there on the right, on top, the coral on the left-hand side is a healthy coral. It's brownish green because it's got all of the zooxanthellae within its tissue. This one on the right is bleached. It has lost its zooxanthellae because the coral is stressed, so it gets rid of those dinoflagellates. And it looks white because the polyp is clear, but yet its limestone or calcium carbonate skeleton is white. So that's what you're seeing. Now, the third threat to coral reefs is coastal dredging and construction, because this forces sediment to wash out to sea and it accumulates on the reefs. And that's what we see in this picture here. All of this that you see here is sediment that's covering over this coral, and that blocks sunlight and causes the corals to die. We're also seeing a greater increase or an increase in coral diseases. These diseases could come from fungi, it could come from cyanophytes or blue-green algae, other bacteria, and other competitive algae that just grow over the corals and displace them. So there are a number of coral diseases that are being monitored in areas like the Florida Keys to see why that is. Is this something caused by climate change or stress from coastal construction in the area? So there's a great deal of concern for our coral reefs in the future. Now, there is a video that is associated with these notes that I would like you to watch. And as you watch it, there are 9 questions. I forgot to put the link up here. I totally forgot. But if you go to the class website, you will see that there is a link for this video on coral reefs. So write down these questions and answer these questions as you watch it. It kind of reviews the concepts that we just talked about here.